Hello everybody and welcome to another episode. So in the last episode I did the honing of the cylinders, and in this episode we are going to put the piston rings on. We're going to do all the measurements and then fit them to the engine. I have actually shot all of this before because I did the two cylinders that are on there now, but it was a bit of a mess because I was kind of figuring it out as I was doing it. And yeah, it was a bit of a mess with the filming. So I thought, now I've had a bit of experience with those two, I kind of know what I'm doing with the other two. So let's get started, shall we? Okay, as you can see, I've got everything ready. I have the other two cylinders with the pistons. I have new piston rings. I have these paper seals. I'm not sure. In the book it says you can either use them or you don't need to, but we'll get to that. I have the guides and head studs to fit to the engine case. So let's get started. The cylinders have now been honed, so they're good, and now we need to change the piston rings. So as you can see, on each piston there are 3 rings. 2 are very similar, but the bottom one is very different. So the bottom one is like an oil scraper. It stops the oil creeping up from the engine case to where the fuel and air ignites. So this basically keeps oil on the piston skirt to keep the bore lubricated, but stops it going any further. So next up we have these 2 compression rings, a top one and the second middle one. Now, as you can see, there is a gap between each ring, even the oil scraper there. And you have to measure this gap, because what happens when the engine gets warm, the metals expand and this gap closes up. So the gap is never that big because it's actually a bit springy. So when this is compressed and inside the bore, this gap is a lot smaller. So we need to measure that to compensate for the heat. So when then obviously the engine heats up, that gap gets even smaller. But if the gap is too small and the engine heats up, then the metal has nowhere to go and it will actually scratch and damage your cylinders, pistons, everything else. We're also going to measure the gap that the ring fits inside. And we're also going to measure the gap of the skirt to the piston. So there's obviously tolerances for all these measurements. So I have the handy book here that I always use. I'm not very good with following instructions, but I try my best. And I have micrometers here to measure stuff. Right, let's get started. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to measure the gap of one of the old rings. So there's different methods of putting these rings on and taking them off. You have like a pair of pliers. You also have like these pliers that lock into place to stop you from over bending them. But the method I'm going to use, that I guess you have to be quite cautious with, because you could overstretch them, is you basically creep it over the side there, and then it does. Sometimes it gets a little bit stuck, but you should be able to go around it like this. Obviously on camera it never happens. There we go, and it just pops off. But be cautious that you don't scratch the piston itself, and then it just winds off like that. So another thing you have to bear in mind is that these have to go a certain orientation, meaning there is etched in one side of the piston ring, it actually says top. You probably can't see that on this camera, but it says top. So this is the top of the cylinder where the head goes. So I actually have one of the heads here, so that goes on there, so that's the top of your cylinder. So the top faces the top, would you believe? So if you put this ring, this is the old ring of course, just inside the lip of the cylinder, and then you turn your piston upside down, and then you push this down until it stops on the second compression ring, give it a little spin, lift it out. That means that this is now seated evenly within the bore, and we can now measure the gap. So I'm expecting it to be bigger than it should be, because this is a used engine, so there will be some wear. And then, so we'll measure this just to get an idea of how big the old ring is, and then we'll measure the new one, and I'll tell you what the tolerances are. So let's start with the biggest feeler gauge I have, which is a 0.6 of a millimeter. And yeah, I mean, you could park a bus in there. So let's get the next one, which is a 0.5 millimeter, I believe. Let's 55. Get a 0.4, so 0.55 of a millimeter. Okay, and so they goes in won't go in there. So get a 0.4, and that just goes in there. Okay, so that's quite snug fit. So I have a 0.6 and a 0.4, so it's 1.1 millimeter gap, which is too big. So the tolerance is, from what I've researched, is 0.016 to 0.018 of an inch. So I obviously got that from an American website. So to convert that into millimeters, the biggest gap would be 0.45 of a millimeter, which is this chap here. So I'm now going to get one of the new rings and see how that measures. Okay, so I have Grant piston rings. I've heard that they're pretty good, so I'll take other people's word for that. And it comes in this neat little package, and it's labelled 1, 2 and 3. So 1, and it also has diagrams, so you can't go wrong. 1 is the top compression ring, 2 is the second one, and then 3rd is the oil scraper. So if we take a number 1, and I guess it doesn't matter, but we'll put it with the top at the top. I don't know if I can show you on that. I don't know if you can see that, because, well, yeah, anyway. So if I put that in the top like this, do the old upside down piston trick, shove that baby in there, give it a twist, and we can see, I can see anyway, that the gap is a lot smaller. Right, so this is the maximum it should be, this 0.45. I don't remember what the conversion was for the minimum, but let's see. So, I mean, I can get it started to go in there, but it doesn't go quite all the way in. So if I get a 0.4, yeah, it's really nice, snug fit in there. So we are within the tolerance. But the thing is, because I'm not an expert engine builder, and this is only the second engine I've built, I don't really understand why the old one was so big. 1.1, that's massive. But anyway, if in the scenario that the gap is too small, you can actually shave a bit off the edges here. There's actually a machine you can get that accurately grinds off a little bit at a time, and then you remeasure it until you get the desired gap, because you don't want that too small. As I said, metals will expand. The metal doesn't have anywhere to go inside the bore, and it will just scrape your cylinders and ruin them. So that's the old one. I'll put it to one side, and I shall take the new one out. Also, I have read that the bottom of the cylinder is the narrowest, and I think it's very, very small difference, but it's a good idea to measure the bottom as well. So let's do it. So I'm going to use the 0.4. Yeah, to me it feels the same as the top, but it's good practice to measure it. So new one, I'll put that back in its little pouch and put that aside. So one of the other things I read about is that you can measure the gap of the skirt. So the skirt being like the bottom of the piston, I think if these get to overheat or they wear out or stuff like that, then they will disform. So let's put it in there, we'll turn it over, and on the other two that I did, I got a 0.08 feeler gauge, so really thin, and I just poked it around the edge of the skirt, and you're just kind of feeling for differences in the gap. And on this, it feels very even. So I don't think that the piston is deformed in any way. So that's one thing to measure. Okay, just before I crack on with that, I've just put in the second compression ring and measuring the gap. And again, it's nice, 0.4, and it feels really good. So that's good. So that's the middle one. One thing I will mention is the reason there is an orientation for the piston rings is because the top of the ring is actually wider in diameter than the bottom, so they're actually tapered like this. In the book here we have a diagram and it shows, oh well, it's quite clear actually. The top ring, the bottom of the ring is wider, and on the second compression ring it looks like it's square, so the top and the bottom are the same, so that's the difference. Okay, so if we just pop these off, being very careful, but these are the old ones, but I'm being careful not to scratch my piston. So I'm like moving it around in a circle while lifting it up, and it kind of, you can feel when it feels right, and you can feel when you're actually stretching it too much. So be very careful, take your time. I'm not experienced at this, but I've kind of got a feel for it. And then you have this scraper, which is different to the ones we're replacing it with, and I shall show you the differences in a second. Okay, with them all removed, I'm now going to clean out the channels that the rings sit in, because it's important to get all the shit out the middle there. And then we're going to measure the gap, and we're going to measure the new rings to make sure that the tolerance is correct. Okay, so I just gave it a clean with a wire brush and some brake cleaner. It's not absolutely spotless, but there's no like debris or anything there anymore. It's just a bit of discoloration. One thing to note is you should always look over your pistons, your cylinders, and every component when you're building an engine. Make sure there's nothing nasty or stands out, like any big gouges or bits missing or scratches, etc. And it looks okay. One thing to note, there is an arrow on here which we will get to later. And the next thing we're going to do is measure these gaps. Okay, so in the book it says that the compression ring gaps is 2 millimeters, which they are. So if I get a new number 1 ring and then measure this, I'm going to measure it with this one because it's got digital numbers on it. Which worked yesterday. Okay, that's weird. This worked yesterday, but obviously the battery's given up. So anyway, So that's 2 millimeters, yeah. So there should be a clearance or a tolerance of 0.1 of a millimeter. So this should be 1.9. So let's get the rings on. So we'll start with the bottom one first, which is the scraper. So in this neat little package, you get the spring, and then you get these thinner rings. Put these back, move them aside, don't need these. Okay, so it's important that it has like these green and red colors on there, and in the instructions that come with these rings that I didn't really read, I looked at the pictures. It says that those should butt up to each other, so they shouldn't overlap like that. They should be like that inside the groove. So let's put this on first, gently, don't rush it, and then they snap together like that. So it actually has a little bit of springiness in there. So you have these two thin rings as well, and they're like retaining rings, and they fit top and bottom of this spring, and you can see that there's actually little tabs. So once this locks in, it stops the spring from being able to come out. So very carefully. I think what I'll do is I'll do it in stages. So I'll put it to the first groove, and then we'll move it down to the next one. Like that. And then we'll get it into its new home. Like, oh, it's easy as that, look. I'm like a pro. And then we'll do the next one. Okay, so there you can see it's in place. The rings are top and bottom, and it's holding the spring where it should be. On to the next. Okay, next up after the oil scraper is the second top ring. So, as I said before earlier, it has etched top there. I measured the gap in the cylinder, and now we will try to get that to go in there somehow. Just like so. And then the top ring. So again, it says top at the top. And this one is a bit easier because it's not got so far to go, and then pops in like that. Okay, so make sure they spin round, they don't get caught up, move freely. Okay, when you've got all your piston rings in place, one important thing you have to be aware of. So let's pretend that this cylinder, the cylinders go like this. So the flaps in the middle. So let's pretend that this is the top of the engine, and let's just say that this side is the flywheel. So if you look on the top of each piston, it has an arrow, and that arrow should point towards the flywheel. So the arrow is there, the top of the engine is there. So you also have to consider, because this is a flat 4 engine, and I would imagine that it is important on all flat 6s, etc., like the Porsches, but you have to place the piston ring gaps in certain orientation. If all the piston ring gaps are in the same place, they can wear a groove into the cylinder wall. So it's best to offset them. And it's also best not to have them at the bottom on a flat engine, because the oil, when the engine's not running, the oil gathers at the bottom of the piston and it can leak through the ring gap. So what we're going to do is we have the oil scraper gaps. So if I get those to the top, like that. So we're going to put them about 1 inch apart, either side of the top of the piston, okay? So they're not lined up with each other. So then the other two, we're going to offset those. I don't know how many degrees that is. Well, anyway, they're not on the side, but they're just offset. So as long as they don't all line up with each other, we're good. So anyway, so the next thing to do is get this little tool, which compresses the rings on the piston. So I did notice that this actually has some damage on one side, so I'm going to put the nice undamaged part on the bottom here. So you basically get a ratchet, open it right up, slip it over. I have to do it like this. So you slip it over, and then we tighten it up. And that compresses your new springs and holds them in position. So okay, so we're pretending that that's the top of our engine, and it will be. So we're not really pretending. We get the arrow pointing towards the flywheel. Now, I like to just tap this tool so it's flush with the top of the cylinder. Yeah, there we go. Okay then, I'm going to leave this episode here. So that's just a video to show how to put the piston rings on. Next up, I need to do some work on the heads before they can be fitted. And before I can fit the cylinders, I need to sort the heads out, because it'll be good to put them all in one go. In the next episode, I think I will get these heads done. I just need to lap the valves, make sure they seal properly, and then we'll get this all buttoned up. So again, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope this has been of some help, and you know what mistakes not to make, because I make them for you, basically. So click the like button, leave a comment. Great to hear from you, and why not subscribe? Okay, until the next video, cheers.